Unlike a lot of my past builds, the inspiration for this one is a bit different and I would argue quite unfortunate. In the past, I usually make a build when I see a cool mechanic, something interesting, a new skill, or really anything that I want to try. I made this build because I was on the verge of quitting the league and giving up on Path of Exile for now, because I just couldn't play. The lag and the performance was too bad. Now, maybe that was my fault for starting a poison build, maybe it was the fault of the terrible optimization for Delirium League, but regardless, I ended up doing a lot of hard thinking and talking to a friend who advised me to try something a little bit more lag-proof based on instant recovery. I took his original idea and I changed some bits here and there, added things like Divine Flesh to suit my taste in defensive layers, and I ended up with this, a Warcry Berserker who uses Cyclone and is as lag-proof as I could possibly make him. So how is the build lag-proof? The build is lag-proof because it uses 2 layers of offense and 2 layers of defense that are almost completely automated. The layers of offense are using Warcries for damage, while also using Cyclone, and I can just hold down a button. My Cyclone will continue. My Warcry is on left click, so it will also continue to trigger regardless of if I'm lagged out. Defensively, the Warcry also functions to almost always be up, as does Berserk, which is sustained through the mob mentality notable on my cluster jewels. So let's get into some of the mechanics of a build and what makes this different from all the other Berserkers that you've probably seen. First of all, it doesn't have an Abyssus on. It does not wear Aspect of Carnage. The point of this was not to make a cast on death build that has really good numbers in Path of Building, or has the top DPS on PoE Ninja. In fact, because I'm using Divine Flesh over the Avatar of Fire keystone, and because I'm using the Brutality support, my damage doesn't even show up on PoE Ninja. According to that, I do 0 damage and can't kill anything. Of course, in-game, this is quite different. So how did I go about making this extremely tanky and extremely high damage Berserker? I started with the fact that the new cluster jewels added a huge amount of customization to the tree, and I decided to build around them quite heavily with this. So for my large, I'm using deep cuts. The other notables aren't necessarily particularly important, although I like Fuel the Fight, so that I can get a little bit of extra mana leech. This helps in things like cannot regenerate mana or less recovery of mana. It really isn't necessary, but it does smooth gameplay. I'm also using Run Through so that I can cap out my Impale chance and get a decent bit of extra Impale effect. The suffixes, 2 jewel sockets are very important. The other suffix can really be any notable. It's not particularly important. I believe Martial Prowess is currently the highest DPS for me, but no matter what you have, it's fine. The real importance and the core and heart of this build is in the medium cluster jewels. I'm using a very specific combo here of 3 Mob Mentality, 1 Cry Wolf, and 2 Warning Call. The Warning Call could be swapped for Lead by Example if you want a little bit of extra fizz reduction and don't care quite as much about damage. The point of the 3 Mob Mentality is, when combined with my Helmet enchant, to maintain a very high, approximately 85% uptime on Berserk. This turns Berserk from a temporary kill the boss buff into a very powerful offensive and defensive buff, as not only does it give you more attack speed, damage, and move speed, it also gives you less damage taken, so it is effectively a second Fortify. Now, Cry Wolf is important because it means every time I Warcry, every 1.1 seconds, it is going to count me as having 10 nearby enemies, so I gain a full 3 endurance charges, and I also gain a bit of life regen. This is a very nice defensive layer, and it ties into the theme of as much recovery from different sources as possible. Now, this is not my strongest form of recovery. My strongest form comes from my small cluster jewels along with my ascendancy. Warbringer causes me to recover 25% of maximum life and mana every time I Warcry, again every 1.1 seconds. On top of this, I'm using Feast of Flesh, so every time I hit an enemy, I gain roughly 50 life, counting both the 3 Feast of Flesh that I have and the additional 20 from my ring. If I'm hitting things 10 to 20 times per second with my Cyclone, that leads to quite a lot of instant life recovery. And the reason this is so important is because there are a lot of mechanics in the game, especially in Delirium, which have less recovery rate of life, energy shield, mana, etc. This does not apply to any form of instant recovery, therefore I'm effectively bypassing that as a bad map mod or something a Delirium enemy can do to me. Now, finally, one other layer of defense that I made sure to add to this build was Divine Flesh. What is Divine Flesh? Divine Flesh says that your maximum chaos resistance is increased by 10% from 75 to 85, and 50% of elemental damage is now taken as chaos. What this means is effectively your elemental resistances are also being increased to roughly 80%, and elemental penetration is cut in half in terms of its effectiveness. This makes you very tanky, especially against enemies that deal chaos damage, because in general, chaos damage is not super high in this game, because GGG doesn't expect every character to walk around with 85% chaos res, and therefore, like with max elemental resists, anytime you go over the cap, you are mitigating a very large portion of damage. A good example of this is that the melee swings from Kosis tickle this character, as opposed to Wrecking, because he does have some innate chaos damage added to his attacks. So now that I've discussed a few of the reasons behind why I made this build, the offense and the defensive layers, let's talk a little bit about some of the unique items that are mechanically important, starting with the weapons. Each manji is itself not mechanically important. What's important is I can corrupt it, and I can get Fortify on hit. This means I don't have to run Fortify support or rely on leap slamming to gain Fortify uptime. Instead, I can focus on just spinning, and therefore winning. It also means that because I can corrupt it, I don't have to risk corrupting the Savior, which is significantly more expensive. And speaking of the Savior, this sword does a lot to increase the quality of life on the build. When clearing maps, it gives coverage because you can essentially be in 3 places at once. Conversely, when fighting a boss, it means that you can step fully away from the boss without being penalized the way a normal melee build would. Normally, when you step away from a boss, you go from dealing 100% damage to dealing 0 damage. Now, you go from dealing 100% damage to dealing 50% damage, which means for most cases, you will gain a lot higher effective DPS uptime. Now, if I truly wanted to maximize DPS uptime, I could instead use Bladestorm. That way, I would not only have my clones attacking the boss while I step away, I would have my Bloodstorms continuing to tick for approximately 3 seconds. But I wanted my build to be as lag-proof as possible, and Cyclone lets me add curse and stun immunity at all times, so I decided that Cyclone was the better choice in this case. Now, the other thing I would like to note is the mechanical difference on Rislatha's Coil, because I've got a lot of questions about this and it's often misunderstood. Let's just pretend that normally I would do 50 to 100 damage. My average damage is 75. Now, Rislatha's Coil lowers the minimum and raises the maximum, which means with a Rislatha's Coil on, I would now do around 32 to 145 damage, which does mean there's more variance and you could get unlucky. But if you're hitting 10 to 20 times a second, getting unlucky on 1 or 2 hits won't really impact your build at all. And quite honestly, the variance in swings in damage is largely a player myth, just like the variance in swings of critting or not critting. But overall, when you're attacking hundreds if not thousands of times per map, you're not going to notice it as much as you think you will. So, 32 to 145. My average damage is now almost 89, which is roughly a 20% increase. This means that this item not only has decent life, but it's incredibly powerful offensively. The final thing I'd like to talk about mechanically is the Lion's Roar Granite Flask. This adds a knockback which can be used to push bosses around. This is largely detrimental, more so than helpful, to be honest. But there are some cases where if a boss is trying to stand in a degen or something, you might be able to push it out and leverage it to your advantage. The main point of a flask is for damage, and you do have to be a little careful when using it to stay on top of the enemy, because as it's pushing away, it is reducing the damage effectiveness of your close combat. If you instead wanted to drop close combat and use Pulverize support, you'd probably clear a lot more efficiently, especially with the Lion's Roar, but you'll lose a very large portion, approximately, I'd like to estimate 10% of your single target damage. So, what is the gameplay style of this build and how might it differ from a lot of other things? Well, largely it doesn't. You're still playing Cyclone, you're really just jumping into the fray of things and spinning until you win, and everything falls over dead. The only thing that I would say is a little different is the interplay between your Berserk and your Dread Banner. Normally when you're playing a Berserk build, you would save that and pop it on the boss, because your Berserk has a fairly low uptime. It takes a long time to build the rage back up, and it's hard to maintain. Mob Mentality solves this by giving us 15 rage every 1.1 seconds on top of the 3 gained per second while actively hitting enemies as a Berserker. So, this means that the downtime for Berserk is only about 4 seconds, but since I'm using this as a defensive layer, a second Fortify if you will, this does leave a window of vulnerability where I'm much more likely to be insta-gibbed by a boss, especially because my overall physical mitigation is not the best on this build. That is the one moderately weak point. It's only okay rather than excellent. So how do I solve this? Well, primarily, I solve this by popping my Dread Banner, because during the active banner placed version of Dread Banner, you gain Fortify effect. And so now, instead of having a second Fortify, I'm doubling my Fortify, which is honestly slightly more effective anyway, because instead of it being roughly 0.8 times 0.8, it is times 0.6. And this is because any less damage taken modifier is applied multiplicatively rather than additively. So what can this character do? What can't it do? There's very few things that the character can't do. I personally struggle very hard with 100% delirious maps because I have a lot of stuttering, and especially if I'm trying to stream or record, my game will completely freeze up, and there's a 50-50 that I either get disconnected or just end up dead by the time the game actually becomes playable again, which has been an ongoing frustration of mine throughout this league, as there's been no other league mechanic in at least PoE's recent history where I've had these troubles with. Now, what can it do? Well, I've done some delving. It was all very smooth. I'm not super deep, but I could easily see this build going as deep as 600 without issues. I have done Uber Elder, Cortex. I've done multiple Cirrus attempts, including Cirrus 8. Cirrus 8 is fairly trivial on this build. You can't necessarily take a die beam if you have nothing up, but if you have your endurance charges, if you have your molten shell, you're going to be fine if you take a die beam. I haven't specifically tried standing in meteors without molten shell or Val molten shell up. It could be that you will take it, but again, it's fairly easy to move out of, so I don't advise it. Based on my experience in the past with Divine Flesh characters, there's a good chance you'll live. As for Shaper, Uber Elder, all that, Guardians, completely destroys them. I barely pay attention to their mechanics. In fact, you will see from my Shaper kill, I kind of intentionally stand in a lot of stuff because it just doesn't matter. So, is this build the absolute best bosser in the game? No, actually, I think a Bladestorm version would be slightly better at bossing, because you don't really have to worry as much about some of the things I'm getting from Cyclone. All you really care about is consistent boss uptime. However, Bladestorm will clear less efficiently, and will be worse of a Simulacrum in my opinion than Cyclone. Which, speaking of Simulacrum, most of my levels, by level 96, almost level 97 as of the time of this video, have been from Simulacrum. So it farms up to wave 20 extremely efficiently, and it can deal with even double boss wave 20s. Sometimes you will explode if there's a bad mod combo and you run out of range of Kosis' melees and cause him to use his fireballs or his lightning. You do have to be aware of that, but largely he's very easy to manage. Just stay in melee, hit him, make sure to pop your Dread Banner, make sure you have that extra defensive layer, make sure to pop your Val Molten Shell, you'll be Gucci. And then, of course, the other question is, how does it map? Well, if we're not counting 100% delirious maps, and if we're putting all performance issues aside, excellently. The reflections from Savior will cover for a lot of the weaknesses in terms of the area of effectiveness build. If you're really super into mapping more so than bossing, I would suggest enemies explode over Frenzy Charge on hit on your chest. Frenzy Charge on hit is kind of a bossing-only affix. Enemies explode will smooth out your clear that little bit extra, especially if you get a Circle of Guilt with increased global physical damage. And overall, I would say this has been an enjoyable build to both map and boss with. I probably would not have taken this beyond 93 or 94 if I wasn't enjoying it a lot. And I think it's super strong, and assuming Warcries don't get nerfed, will continue to be viable in future leagues. Alright, now on to talk about the skill tree a little bit. So the first thing that's maybe a little unconventional is, instead of pathing around this way, or maybe pathing up this way, I decided to come right out through Diamond Skin. This is to make my itemization a little bit easier, and also to conserve points, because I could go, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's one less point, but I get strength, which is not particularly helpful or efficient. This way, at least I'm saving a bit of all res and increasing my armor rating, which does help for my Molten Shell and Val Molten Shell. It's not strictly wrong to go 1, 2, 3, 4 and connect that way. You could even potentially get Steadfast, but I don't think it's very helpful in this case. Maybe if you're going Bladestorm, it would be different, because then you'd want potentially the Unwavering Stance for stun immunity, and you might also stand still enough to actually get a benefit from Steadfast. After that, I come down over here and up here to get my 2 cluster jewels. This is the bulk of my skill tree. Actually, about 40 points are taken up by both of these clusters, and that's because I'm using a lot of mechanics that can only be found on cluster jewels. And then my tree gets a little bit weird because I'm stretching all the way up here. Now this does look a little bit different in game. I would have the Avatar of Fire. The only reason I don't is, as you can see, my DPS goes away because there's no way to tell it that this is actually Divine Flesh. This is my really nice defensive layer. Divine Flesh causes me to take 50% of elemental damage as chaos, which effectively raises my defense against elemental and elemental penetration, and it also raises my max chaos resist by 10 from 75 to 85, which makes me very resistant to chaos damage. It's also a nice way to get a little extra chaos res by pathing by Purity of Flesh. So overall, the tree is very, very bare bones. It very heavily relies on cluster jewels, and that's what it was meant to do. This is not the tree I leveled with. I will include in the description below a PoE URL to the tree I leveled with. The leveling for this build was nothing particularly special. I just put on some face breakers, and I went with it. Alright, so now that I've talked about a lot of the mechanics of a build, my reasons for making it, and my choices on the skill tree, I would like to talk a little bit about my thoughts, because I've played a lot of builds in PoE, and I've played a lot of Cyclone builds before. I've even played a few Berserker builds before. Where does this stand? Well, in terms of smoothness of gameplay, this is one of the best Berserkers I've played since Volpact was nerfed. And it does feel really good. It handles all content. I would definitely play it again. Now, where does it stand in terms of Cyclone? Honestly, I can't say it necessarily feels that much different from a more typical Cyclone build, such as I've played previously. I do think that I notice the additional layers of instant recovery. That's awesome, and I do notice the additional damage reduction from Berserk. But aside of that, you spin, you win, it's fairly standard. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this guide. I hope you found the explanations helpful. I will include in the description below a link to the full written guide on the Path of Exile forums, where I go over all of this. I'll also include a link to a playlist that is going to contain all of my boss fights on this build. I tried to hit all of the major ones. I cleared a map, did a Cortex. Again, I apologize that I do not have a full 100% Delirious map clear. The performance just makes recording in it a pain, and I didn't think anyone wanted to see a bunch of blurry pixels with some freezing in the screen from time to time. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you have success with this build, please let me know down in the comments below. If you have any additional questions, please let me know in the comments, stop by my stream, or feel free to message me in Path of Exile. One note, I have several times in the past regarding guides gotten whispers on Twitch or on the Path of Exile forums. Please do not do that. I probably won't read it for several months if you do, because I'm really bad at checking those things. Get in touch with me in-game, preferably through my stream chat or down in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Stay sane, Exile.